It's been a while since we've stepped out into the deep water, searching for the unknown, or letting the unknown search for us. If you enjoy the ocean or love to fish, today's your lucky day. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Today's episode features deep sea horror stories and disturbing things found at sea. Thalassophobia will be jumping out at you from your headphones tonight, so be ready. If you have a scary story of the unknown, send it to me at darkstories.org. Support us by becoming a member at eeriecast.com/plus to unlock access to exclusive bonus content, and help us become the biggest scary podcast out there by following and leaving a review of Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Cliffside View from Garbled, Johnsense. Look, I hate to be that kind of grandkid, but I never liked my grandparents' cottage. They owned it on a rocky stretch of coast in Maine, perched too close to a steep cliff. Each summer, Mom would drop me off for a few weeks. She thought fresh air and an ocean view would do me good. But that view, it was the worst. My bedroom faced that cliff and sea, which some might call picturesque, but to me it was all jagged rocks, gray waves, and a constant sense of being exposed and too high up. Yes, I've got a fear of heights, how could you tell? The first night I struggled to sleep. The bed smelled like old blankets and salt. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was staring at me through that window. At one point, I forced myself to look. The curtains there were thin, and I could make out the faint glow of the moon and the outline of the cliff. But nothing moved, and there were no figures, and yet my heart pounded like there was something there. Eventually, I did doze off, but I had nightmares of falling into sea foam. The next morning, Grandma served pancakes while Grandpa puttered around with fishing gear. I was happy that they seemed so at ease living here. And that thought made me feel stupid with the idea of mentioning my nightmares at all. So I tried to act brave and normal. I helped Grandma with the dishes, then followed Grandpa around in the garden. At dinner time, the ocean breeze rattled the windows of the old place. I caught a glimpse of the cliffs glowing under the setting sun too. Gave me a chill. I went to bed early that night. Maybe I could fall asleep quick, tricking my mind before I could have nightmares or feel anything strange. But the second night was worse. The wind picked up around midnight and I lay there awake, convinced that I was hearing footsteps scraping along the rocks outside. Around 3 a.m., I sat up, trembling. I looked at the window again, hoping I wouldn't see a face pressed against the glass. Nothing. Still, my stomach was near my heart. I shut my eyes, even though I kept feeling that feeling, like I wasn't alone. Anytime I drifted off, I would be jolted awake soon after, this time from brief nightmares of something crawling up the cliff. By dawn, I was exhausted. On the third morning, soft light pulled me out of a fitful dream. The sun was barely up, and the sky was pale pink. That eerie someone's watching me feeling struck again, and my grandparents, unfortunately, weren't awake yet. My pulse was setting records, and I wanted to hide under the covers. I then decided I was done being so scared. My grandparents have been living here no problems, right? And I didn't want to be some scaredy cat of the family. I crept over to the window. I kind of half-crouched. I looked out. The cliff looked empty. The tide was low, revealing more rocks at the base. There were patches of seaweed, small pools, and sharp ridges. My gaze went back and forth. I told myself I wasn't going to see anything, that the odd feelings I had about the place didn't make sense, and I didn't need them to. But then I spotted movement near the very bottom, where the rocks met the water. A man sat hunched on the stones. His skin was shockingly pale, and he looked skinny, almost skeletal. His limbs were long and his flesh appeared wrinkled or pruned, like he'd been soaking in the ocean for days. Worse, he was wearing nothing at all. He just sat there, nude, staring at the sea. I was frozen to the spot. I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Was this some weird neighbor? Or something else? Who would be down there naked at sunrise? Maybe he needed some help, but fear pinned me in place. I felt like everything was going in slow motion then, especially when I saw him turn his head. And even from that distance, I saw him look right at me. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Then I swear he smiled. An unmistakable wide grin, but it didn't feel friendly. It felt wrong, like he was amused to have an audience. Before I could think even a single other thought, he dropped into the water. It wasn't a dive or a jump. He just leaned forward, vanishing beneath the waves, letting the water have him. No splashing came after, no struggle. One moment he was there and the next he was gone. My legs were shaking like there was an earthquake beneath me. I jumped away from the window. What if it was a normal man and he was hurt? I couldn't bring myself to go outside. I dashed back into bed, yanking the covers over my head, trying to breathe calmly. If I couldn't go back to sleep for another hour, I thought surely I was about to faint and sleep anyway. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Grandpa, awake, early to make coffee. I felt so relieved. At least I wasn't alone in that silent house anymore. I tossed on some clothes and hurried to the kitchen, pretending I just woke up. Grandpa smiled and asked if I wanted oatmeal or eggs. I mumbled something and kept looking over at the cliff through the window above the sink. From there, everything looked normal, like nothing strange had happened. And to this very day, I hope beyond hope that what I saw out of that window in that little room was just a very vivid dream, a sleepwalking nightmare. But I'm here sharing this story with you because I don't think it was. There's something down there. From DeepWavesAnon. I want to remain as anonymous as possible, but I will tell you I've served as an oceanographic researcher with a multinational deep-sea expedition team. We would travel aboard a research vessel outfitted with remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, and submersibles capable of descending into some of the ocean's deepest trenches. Over the years, we've mapped sections of the Mariana Trench, Tonga Trench, and others, recording new species of amphipods, discovering hydrothermal vents, and collecting valuable data on plate tectonics. In 2021, our team embarked on a 3-month mission focusing on the Challenger Deep region of the Mariana Trench, the deepest known spot in the Earth's oceans. Our vessel was equipped with a specially designed submersible, rated for depths over 36,000 feet. We intended to deploy advanced sensors, collecting water and sediment samples in zones never before reached by mankind. I was part of the submersible crew. 1 pilot, Hannah, 1 co-pilot, myself, and a mission specialist, Dr. Chin. Obviously, I've changed these names to aliases. Our dives lasted up to 12 hours at a time, with strict protocols for oxygen, temperature, and hull integrity. The deeper we descended, the more our world became a realm of darkness, lit only by the sub's external lamps. Temperatures often hovered near freezing, and pressure would soar to over 1,000 times that at the surface. It was like venturing onto an alien planet beneath our own seas. On our 3rd dive into Challenger Deep, we planned to explore a section mapped only once before. The coordinates suggested a steep slope, descending into an even deeper pocket. At around 35,700 feet, The sub's external lights revealed a barren seafloor. Fine sediment, occasional rock outcrops. Strange, jelly-like creatures drifted by, the species I can't remember off the top of my head. Then we approached a drop-off that sloped into a small canyon. The environment was eerily still. No visible fish or crustacean, just emptiness. Dr. Chen commented on the absence of typical trench fauna. No snailfish or amphipods. We hovered at the canyon entrance, shining our beams into the void. Our sonar picked up something inside. Dense clusters of something that reflected faintly. We inched forward. The sub's manipulator arms were extended, ready to grab samples. As we glided closer, deeper into the canyon, our lights began illuminating odd shapes on the seafloor. Piles of fragmented exoskeletons. Small bones, some from fish, others from unknown things. It looked like a graveyard. My stomach was in knots. I'm not supposed to be telling you any of this, to put it bluntly, which is why I'm keeping everything anonymous. Anyway, something was feeding down here, on anything that ventured close. Hannah pointed out movement on the sonar. A large object, bigger than any known trench creature, shifting behind a rock formation. I stared at the screen. It wasn't a glitch, the reading was consistent. About 10 feet in length, moving quite slow, in deliberate pulses. We swung our cameras that way, scanning. The lights caught an outcrop, behind which the darkness seemed deeper, almost swirling. For a second, I thought I saw something like reflective eyes, maybe bioluminescent spots. Could be a sleeper shark, Dr. Chen said. The shape moved again, sliding out of the camera's view. We advanced slow. Every rational part of me said we were safe inside that titanium sphere, but instinctively, I felt afraid. Deep-sea creatures usually ignore submersibles like this. But this, well, it felt like it was watching us, and acted like it too. We reached the outcrop, shining our main beams around. Empty. Hannah adjusted the sub's angle, turning to the seafloor. It was then that we saw a massive trench in the sediment, as if something had been dragged. It curved around the rocks, leading deeper into the canyon. Dr. Chen insisted that we follow, so we proceeded at a crawl, floodlights sweeping over ridges of sediment and scattered remains. The trail began to look fresher. Then, the sub shook. Lights flickered. Instruments beeped with warnings of a minor hull contact on the starboard side. Something had tapped us. My heart leapt right into my throat. Hannah steadied the sub, scanning external cameras. I peered at the feed. All I saw was swirling sediment. But then we heard a faint scraping, as though claws or teeth dragged across the metal. Dr. Chen's eyes went wide. We pivoted the sub, shining our beams behind us. We saw a shape dart away. Long, slender, perhaps eel-like, but thick, with a hide that shimmered under the light. The speed was startling for a deep-sea creature. "Did you see that?" Hannah hissed. We all nodded. Our training told us to remain calm and gather data. We performed a slow 360-degree turn. The scraping noises echoed again from above. I angled the top camera. And then we saw something. An enormous creature latched onto the sub's top surface. It looked like it was gnawing or scraping at the external shell. Its body seemed part serpent, part crustacean. Translucent plates along its dorsal ridge, a lamprey-like mouth ringed with spines. The length was easily 15 feet, if not more. It half-coiled around the sub, segments undulating in the current. It was trying to bite through the metal. I don't think my pulse has ever been that fast before. Hannah triggered the sub's thrusters, hoping to shake it off. We jolted, swirling sediment. The creature released us floating backward, revealing 2 pale, bulbous eyes and a ring of teeth. Then it shot away, lightning quick, disappearing beyond camera range. We didn't wait for a second attack. Dr. Chin agreed we should ascend. Hannah angled the sub upward, increasing thrust. But then the manipulator arm jerked. That same animal clamped onto it, jaws trying to tear through the metal. I swear I saw a spark then, and I gasped. Dr. Chin fought to retract the arm, but it seemed jammed. An alarm blared. Hannah gunned the forward thrusters. The manipulator arm, now half severed, was torn away in the creature's jaws. Freed, we sped away, at the safest but fastest possible pace we could. Our sonar beeped with multiple large contacts closing in from behind. There's no way there's more of them, I thought. But we reached open trench water, away from that canyon. A high-frequency deterrent we carried may have helped us, because we saw the shapes fall back. When we finally surfaced, the Calypso's crew hauled us aboard. We stumbled out, recounting the attack. The sub's arm was mangled, the hull gouged. Everyone was stunned. We had to cut the expedition short and sign NDAs once we returned to port. I still have nightmares of the teeth scraping our hull, and the knowledge that there's something like that down there. It both excites me and terrifies me. Tell me if you agree with this statement. It's not surprising that something like that exists in the deep, dark oceans. The Moaning Fog, from JorunnS. Hello everyone, and thank you for giving my story a chance. I hail from a small coastal town in northern Norway, in the county of Tromsø, Finnmark. It's pretty rugged terrain, and the winters can stretch on seemingly forever. But we do get nice views of the aurora every now and then. Growing up, I often spent summers fishing for cod and pollock with my father. We'd ride our modest boat through the still waters at sunrise, making sure to bunch up in layers of wool and waterproof jackets. Most of the time, it would just be us and some seagulls. Not all fishing trips were peaceful, though. The Arctic weather can be unforgiving. You've got to be real careful when storm clouds roll in and thick fogs appear without warning. One August, I experienced a fog unlike any other I'd seen before, or since for that matter. It wasn't a typical mist. Strangely enough, it brought this sound with it. A low moaning sound, very haunting the more I heard it. My father and I had gone out early that day. We wanted to find a good catch of cod. The morning was calm and the water was like glass, the way we like to see it. It was around 6 a.m. when we noticed thin wisps of fog forming at the mouth of the fjord. Fog was not unusual here, especially when warmer currents met colder air. We kept an eye on it though, but it seemed benign at first, just a soft blanket rolling in. However, as the sun rose high, the fog got thicker, almost into a seemingly impenetrable wall. We lost sight of the shore, and that worried us. My father was an experienced fisherman, so he navigated us using old landmarks and a well-worn compass. For a time, we drifted slowly, waiting for visibility to improve. But then the sound came. It was faint at first. It sounded like a distant wail carried by the still air. I thought it was the wind going through the fjords weird. Wind can sound strange in the right terrain. But the more I listened to it, the more it seemed more like a voice, long and drawn out, moaning in patterns or rhythm. My father looked even more concerned than before. He's an old guy. He's heard many strange things out here before, but this unsettled him, and that freaked me out. We tried calling back, thinking it was someone maybe in distress, but it sounded like the fog itself dampened our voices. But the moaning went on. Each time it came, it seemed closer. Our little engine sputtered as my father tried to keep us moving. He muttered about crossing the channel to find clearer water. Then we saw the shapes. There were dark silhouettes drifting past. Some were seagulls or drifting seaweed, but others were unidentifiable. Once I glimpsed something tall and spindly, like a piece of driftwood, standing upright. But that didn't make sense. Whatever it was, it vanished before I could point it out. My father, keeping his eyes on the compass, began to look more focused, or maybe a bit panicked. I don't think I'd ever seen him like that. We heard the moaning getting even louder. It was almost like it was circling us. Twice I rushed to the side of the boat, expecting to see another vessel or maybe a seal. There was nothing but swirling mist and faint outlines of waves lapping the bow. Eventually the sound turned into a chant, broken up by these guttural noises. Made my skin crawl. The compass began to act strangely, spinning all over the place. My father tapped it, cursed under his breath, but he couldn't get it to align. He muttered something about electrical interference, but that didn't make sense to me. We had very few electronics on board, just a basic fish finder and a radio. But maybe he was right. The fish finder was displaying static, and the radio was crackling some nonsense. That was when we nearly ran aground, or that's what we thought happened at first. The boat scraped something solid beneath the water, so Father cut the engine and we drifted. While holding me back a bit, he peered over the side. I tried to as well. What I could make out from that distance were shards of old wood and lumps of seaweed floating up. I could smell rotting timber, too. Looked to me like we ran over the remains of an older wreck. As we stared, the moaning around us grew even louder, and I swear, it sounded like it was coming from below us. Just as my father glanced at his compass again to check it, I swear on my life I saw a face in the water. Blanched with wide eyes, mouth open like it was moaning. Maybe that's what we were hearing. When my father looked back up, he jumped as if he'd seen it too. Without a word, he ran over and started the engine again and steered us blindly forward, away from that spot. Maybe I was scared, but maybe I wasn't scared enough, because it almost looked like the fog was following us. The two of us remained silent, probably both of us hoping that we would see land soon. At some point, my father yelled in frustration and cut the engine. Then, the moaning just stopped. You'd think the silence was welcomed, but it was just as scary. There was a splash then, something heavy slipping into the water near us. I leaned on the rail and glimpsed a silhouette sinking below. It looked human in shape, but longer. But then again, the water can deform silhouettes like that. I watched the shape vanish into the dark waters. Miraculously, after several minutes, the fog started to thin up, and finally, we saw the rugged coastline again. We'd come out near a rocky inlet miles from where we started. My father started the engine, and we raced back towards land. My father and I would very rarely speak of that day again. And the compass was never the same either. Dang thing never pointed to true north ever again. I wonder if maybe we had crossed a realm of lost souls or something. Maybe ancient spirits roaming the fjord in an uncanny fog. Maybe we had happened across the restless souls of some wreckage. Whatever it was, I didn't like it, and I pray we never run into something like that again. Drifting with the Devils. From Anonymous. Former French Navy here. Darkness, I noticed you don't get a lot of Navy stories, but maybe we can change that. For several years, I patrolled waters from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And during that time, something very strange happened to me. Something nightmarish. One evening, we received a distress call from a small cargo ship flagged under the Comoros. We couldn't understand the details, but we set out nonetheless. By the time we had arrived, night had fallen. All we saw were silhouettes of waves under a moonlit sky. Our radar didn't show anything weird. We were about to call off the search when a lookout spotted debris in the water. Smashed crates and empty barrels, even twisted metal. We didn't find the distressed ship, and would later learn they were able to safely dock somewhere, though suffered some damage that we still didn't get an explanation for. However, we stayed in those waters for a few days. This was still during the time we thought the ship was in trouble, or perhaps even sank. On night watch, we picked up faint lights on radar, then lost them. We went out on deck to investigate. I was with the crew looking with spotlights, and I'll never forget what they revealed. There were these scaly shapes swirling just beneath the surface in the water. Some of them came close enough to the surface that I could make out details. Human-like skulls, but mouths full of needle-like teeth. Either the most bizarre and terrifying fish we'd ever seen, or something else entirely. Worse yet, some of them began to scratch at the hull. They couldn't do any damage to us, but the sound was nauseating and horrific. A couple of the guys on the crew, apparently given permission, fired at the things in the water, which quickly retreated and disappeared. We would actually patrol that sector for about a month, but we never did see those things again. And we did wonder that maybe the ship we were trying to find, what with its weaker hull and likely cheaper build, might have been damaged by these things and panicked. This is something I wanted to share, something I'm never gonna forget. Night of the Lanternfish, from BajaExplorer. One summer when I was 21, living in a fishing village on the Baja California Peninsula in Mexico, I joined my father on an overnight fishing run off the coast, near Isla Espiritu Santo. We planned to catch squid using lights at night, then hope for dorado at dawn. By midnight, we were a dozen nautical miles from shore. We had some overhead lights rigged to attract squid. The water looked greenish that night. There was plankton and some small fish in the water. My dad and I were just talking quietly and sipping at coffee. At one point in the distance, we saw what looked like thousands of tiny lights bobbing on the surface. At first, I thought it was a type of plankton. Some of them actually glow. But this looked different than plankton. They were in lines and clusters, way too organized. We killed the overhead lights to get a better look. Curiosity got the better of us. We steered toward the glowing patches. Soon, the water around us was lit up. Suddenly, there were splashes on the sides of our boat, like something was breaching near the boat. I hoped it was just dolphins, but the lights flickered away from the surface. Whatever they were diving back down. My father leaned over the side with a flashlight. I heard him scream then, repeatedly saying, I, and pointing at the water. I went to look. Sure enough, something that looked like a grapefruit-sized eye looked at us from the water. It was part of a pale face that looked neither fish nor human. It swam down, disappearing quickly. A couple of moments later, a bigger splash rocked the boat, showering us in water. The water began to churn then, something slithering around us and under us. I was scared we might be capsized. My father tossed in a flare, causing the creatures to scatter. We took the chance to start the engine and race away. We discussed the event with other fishermen, but they told us it was sea spirits, which honestly we scoffed at. Whatever's out there is just an animal, though it's something very intimidating, possibly very dangerous too. Something I've never seen again. Haunted Yacht, from Gribby. Everyone wishes they had a rich uncle, but I'll bet they don't wish that rich uncle's yacht was also haunted. That's something I learned firsthand when I was 9 years old. My family wasn't well off. Dad worked construction, Mom did part-time at a grocery store. So luxury was never something my brothers and I experienced until Uncle Leonard. He's the wealthiest member of our extended family. Uncle Leonard invited us to spend certain weekends on his yacht. At first, we thought it was some kind of fairy tale, a sprawling boat with polished wood decks and plush cabins. But those weekends would become seared into my memory for other reasons. When he visited and first asked if Peter, Gus, and I, those are my two brothers, could spend weekends on his yacht, my parents were surprised. He said it would be educational, as if riding around on a floating mansion could teach us some life lessons. Dad was reluctant at first, but Leonard insisted. He would even do the pickup and drop-off. Mom eventually said it could be fun. She was excited for us, but I think she also felt we might get a glimpse into a world that could inspire us to aim higher. The first time we stepped onto that yacht, I could hardly believe such a thing existed. The railings were so glossy, and the deck was almost perfectly scrubbed. Each interior cabin looked like a room in a 5-star hotel, complete with satin bedspreads, flat-screen TVs, and little vases of fresh flowers on end tables. I was awestruck and a little nervous. I almost felt guilty with so much luxury around me. Not sure why or what it means, but that's just how I felt. I don't think my oldest brother, Peter, and my other brother, Gus, who was a year younger than Peter, cared the same way I did. They went about racing around exploring the place. Eventually, I joined them. We spent that whole first day just looking over every nook and cranny. Uncle Leonard showed us the bridge, where a professional captain sometimes guided the yacht, though Uncle Leonard proudly said that he was also licensed to pilot it himself. He showed us the galley, the living area, which he called the saloon, and our private sleeping quarters. Our room was at the stern, with 3 single beds lined against the walls and a single porthole to let in natural light. Uncle Leonard's own suite was down the corridor, behind a locked door he jokingly referred to as the command center. From our room, we could hear the onboard generator and the gentle slosh of water. Everything was mesmerizing. That night, the wind picked up and the boat began to sway. Nothing too dramatic, but definitely enough to make me remember that I was not used to this kind of thing. We were on our beds, lights off. I couldn't sleep. I was listening to the gentle creaking of the yacht. I think within an hour or two I managed to go to sleep though. But when I woke up the next morning, Gus looked pale. He said he woke up in the middle of the night and heard someone whispering outside our cabin door. Said that it didn't sound like wind or waves. He said it was more like someone talking under their breath, pacing back and forth in the hallway. Neither Peter nor I heard anything though, but Gus was sure. Peter teased him and said it was just his imagination or a dream. But I believed Gus, didn't think he'd be tricking us like that. Aside from that incident, our first weekend ended without any major scares. Uncle Leonard treated us to a fancy dinner at the marina, then dropped us home on Sunday evening. Over the next couple of weeks, we resumed our normal lives, school, chores, and after-school activities. But we looked forward to going back eventually. Uncle Leonard did invite us back a few weeks later. I was excited, but instantly reminded about Gus's experience. We would go, and Dad reminded us to be polite, to make the most of the opportunity but be respectful. That Friday afternoon, we once again boarded his yacht. The first few hours passed quietly. Uncle Leonard was in high spirits. We ate from fruit platters and he let us watch whatever we wanted on the yacht's entertainment system. The weather was clear and bright too, a perfect weekend to be on the water. Unexpectedly though, that night a mild storm rolled in. We could see lightning on the horizon, though the yacht didn't rock too much. Peter and Gus were in the saloon scanning through channels for a spooky movie to watch. I was watching out of a porthole, absolutely taken by the flashes of light illuminating the dark sea. At one point, a bolt of lightning lit up the saloon so bright, the reflection in the glass suddenly showed a figure standing in the corridor behind us. I saw it. My heart skipped a beat and I spun around, but no one was there. I just stared at that corridor for a long moment. There was no movement, and the only sounds were the distant thunder and the subtle hum of the yacht's engine. I felt a chill, like I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I told Peter and Gus what happened. Gus believed me right away. Peter once again tried to brush it off. He just saw Uncle Leonard walking by, or even some sort of distorted reflection. But I don't think it was either of those things. It looked more like a shadow of a figure, briefly standing there watching us. We stayed awake later than usual, dozing off in sleeping bags which we'd spread out on the saloon's plush carpet. Around midnight, the overhead lights began to flicker, which we'd kept on for ourselves. I was just beginning to drift off to sleep, but that woke me right up. The flicker lasted only a second, so when it was over, I tried to go back to sleep. But a few minutes later, the lights flickered again, much more violently than last time. And it was then that I heard footsteps. They were slow, almost cautious, like someone walking but also trying not to wake other people up. There was a tap, tap, tap. I could barely breathe. Suddenly, Gus grabbed my arm, and we stared at Peter. They were both awake, and they were both hearing it. Peter pulled out a flashlight, and together we decided to investigate. He took the lead, and we followed him down that corridor, which felt colder than the saloon, like the air conditioner had kicked into overdrive, but just right there. There was no sign of anybody. Uncle Leonard's door was shut, and we could hear him snoring in there. We tiptoed back to the saloon, feeling creeped out. Eventually, we lay back down and went to sleep. By morning, the storm had passed, and Uncle Leonard seemed blissfully unaware of anything unusual. Breakfast was served with cheerful conversation, and we felt almost foolish bringing up our concerns again. But when Dad picked us up that Sunday, Gus insisted on telling him. After hearing the story, Dad chalked it up to typical boat noises and electrical issues caused by the storm. But even after these explanations, I didn't believe it. I was starting to think that the yacht might be haunted, no matter how silly that might sound. A month went by, and Uncle Leonard arranged another visit. He would be hosting a party on his yacht at the marina, and he wanted us around to meet some important guests. I wasn't sure what that meant. We arrived on a bright morning, and the day was a whirlwind of caterers, waitstaff, and well-dressed strangers nibbling on hors d'oeuvres. For a time, the bustling yacht made it feel less creepy. People were laughing and clinking their champagne glasses. Late that evening, once the guests had gone, Uncle Leonard told us to get some rest. We would be sleeping in our old cabin at the stern. The moment I stepped into that cabin, a wave of dread washed right over me. The 3 beds were made up neatly, crisp white sheets and matching blankets. We could barely see out the small porthole because it was so dark out, and the overhead lights seemed too bright. We settled in, agreeing that something did feel strange that night, for one reason or another. An hour later, everything changed. When we were about to drift off to sleep, the lights started to dim. Not flickering this time, but steadily dim, like someone twisting a dial to lower the brightness. Peter jumped out of bed to check the switch. It didn't matter. The lamps remained unnaturally low. And, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut. Gus yelped, and I almost dropped the flashlight, which I kept by my bedside. Peter rushed to the door, but the knob wouldn't budge, as though it was locked from the outside. Or perhaps someone was holding on to it. I could hear Peter calling out for Uncle Leonard, but he didn't get a reply. Gus and I just sat there. I was shaking. My breathing got all ragged. That was when the temperature plummeted. One moment the cabin was warm, and the next, I swear it felt like an icebox. It was so cold, I began to chatter my teeth. When I looked down, I could see my own breath too. By the now faint light, I noticed something else. The blankets on our beds had been pulled partway down, though none of us had done that. Then abruptly, the overhead lights blazed back to full strength, hurting our eyes. Peter tried the door again, and it opened easily now. It made no sense. We ran out into the corridor. The hallway was dark, but there was a single emergency light at the end, just a subtle yellow glow. There was a nasty smell in the air, rancid and metallic. We walked along the hallway. We weren't sure if we should go get Uncle Leonard or just escape to the saloon. Before we could decide, we heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A gentle lullaby-like humming sound, drifting from the far end of the corridor. It was soft. You could even call it sweet, yet it carried this sorrow with it. I recall the hairs on my arms standing straight up. I then saw some movement in the dark. There was a figure swaying in time with the humming. It looked pale, almost translucent, more like fog than a solid form. Peter then pointed the flashlight. For a second, I saw a woman's face, eyes dark and mouth moving as she hummed. Then the shape dissolved, leaving only a sort of afterimage in our eyes or minds. The humming stopped abruptly too. We stood there terrified. That was all we could take. We bolted to the saloon, nearly tripping over each other. The saloon was brightly lit and empty. The area was spotless again after the party. Uncle Leonard's suite door was closed, and we didn't hear any sounds from him. We huddled together real close on the couch, not saying much. Part of me wanted to pound on his door to make him wake up, beg him to take us off the yacht for a while. But I was comfortable, finally felt safer, and didn't want to move. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough to get us to sleep. When we woke up, there was sunlight coming through the saloon windows. Though our freakout from the night before felt distant, we knew it was real. Uncle Leonard, now awake, greeted us with a cheery smile. He asked if we liked the party. He made a few jokes about us being late sleepers, and said he would let us rest, since we seemed all tuckered out. We didn't know whether he truly believed nothing was wrong, or if he was aware and just ignored it. Honestly, if I had to guess, I think Uncle Leonard actually never experienced this kind of stuff. Maybe something on his boat was always there, quiet and unseen, and for some reason it didn't like us. Maybe it just didn't like kids. That Sunday, when Mom and Dad arrived to pick us up, we told them everything. We cooperated with the story, so that none of us could be accused of exaggeration. Even Peter, who was the biggest skeptic among us, confirmed every detail. Gus looked like he might cry after talking about the humming woman. I remember Mom and Dad looking at each other like, what the heck? But Uncle Leonard offered practical excuses. Old electrical systems or powerful air conditioning and overactive imaginations. He even said that newbie sleepers on boats often have weird dreams when they're not used to the waves. I didn't know about that. I think he was scared we wouldn't be allowed to go back to stay with him on weekends anymore if we kept getting scarred or scared. Poor Leonard. It really wasn't him. We didn't want to go back because we didn't want to see anything else like that. My brothers and I are adults now. Sometimes we do talk about what we saw. We never could figure out why the yacht was haunted. All we have are some loose theories. As for Uncle Leonard, he died a few years ago. Part of his will was to sell the yacht, and his siblings and cousins would divide up the money. And that's pretty much the end of the story. Doubt I'll ever see that yacht again. But I do miss Uncle Leonard. A quick, not-so-unexplained story. Night diving at Electric Beach. From Christopher 414. I'm going to recount a pretty disturbing story from when I was a kid living in Hawaii. I was fortunate to have grown up in the great state of Hawaii. My father was in the Navy and stationed at Pearl Harbor on sub base. He got me into snorkeling and scuba diving at an early age. When I was about 10 or 11, I was pretty accomplished when it came to doing things in the water. I was on the swim team, used to race lasers. It's a sleek little one-person sailboat. Did a wreck dive on the Mahi. Used to collect sea creatures for an aquarium shop with my dad. etc. One weekend, my dad got a call from his buddy John, saying that he wanted to do a night dive at Electric Beach. My dad was interested, so he checked in with the Admiral, aka my mom, to see if it was okay. Admiral said it was good to go. He just needed to bring home something to eat. I heard the whole conversation from up in my room, so I ran downstairs to ask if I could go. The Admiral actually said yes, and so I was allowed to go with him. We got our gear together in about an hour. We loaded things up into the old Jeep and headed out to the spot. Electric Beach is just a little inlet, about the size of a large backyard, right next to a power plant on the west side of Oahu, and it has two of the biggest cooling pipe outlets 300 meters offshore and about 30 meters down. We took some time to set some crab traps, which was illegal, and decided to just explore the area. Underwater looks so much more ominous at night, I'll tell you that, compared to the daytime. My father and his buddy started to make a beeline for a certain section of the area, and I followed them. We were on the surface still, with our BCDs still inflated, so I thought it was cool. They got to a point where the water was a little rougher than usual, and vented their BCDs. Naturally, I followed suit. Little did I know that they were dropping right in front of the outlet pipes, and I had no idea. After about a minute, I noticed I could not see my father or John anymore, and I could not see the bottom of anything anymore. At that point, the 10 or 11-year-old me straight up panicked. I inflated my BCD, shot to the surface and tried to get orientated. Didn't work. I couldn't see lights. I couldn't hear anyone. I pretty much hyperventilated so much that I had nothing left in my dive tanks, and I was in the middle of the ocean with no reference of where the heck I was at. I'm not sure how long it was. Felt like dozens of hours, but probably was just 20 minutes, when I saw some lights off to my left, and I heard a car horn honking in a very distinct honk 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 pattern. I almost walked on water and headed straight for that glorious goodness. Turns out that my dad drove that old Jeep right up onto the upper area in the picnic area, giving me a makeshift lighthouse. After getting back to shore the whole time sobbing hysterically, freaking out, thinking I was going to get snatched up by one of the various shark gods in the Hawaiian pantheon, I realized I was only about 50 feet from the beach. But I did think I was about to die. Wrinkles on the water's surface. From Anonymous. I'll start by saying I'll never get on a boat again. When I was about 10 years of age, I took a vacation with my grandparents to Florida. I was excited. It would be the first time I would ever experience the deep blue color and salty air of the ocean. I was in awe as I ran down the beach until my feet hit the water. I grew up on the river, but I had never seen this much water before. I spent an hour splashing in the waves. I then noticed a young tan boy staring at me. I waved and smiled at him, never one to be shy. I even beckoned him over to come play with me. He seemed enthusiastic and came over. Another hour passed as we splashed in the water or built sloppy sculptures in the sand. He asked me if I wanted to walk the beach line with him. He wanted to show me something, so I agreed, and we set off together down the beach. Not too long after that, we came to a large inlet that was more of a lagoon. A small sort of river was feeding fresh water into the lagoon, mixing with the salt water, making it a murky blue color. It reflected the light of the sun, making it look like a natural pool. He took my hand, saying, "This way," and pulled me by the arm. As we passed by a large rock, I noticed a strange symbol carved into it, and at the same time I noticed a boat that we were headed towards. "Where are we going?" I asked the boy. I remember what he said. "The middle." And then he stepped onto the boat. When we got closer to the middle of the lagoon, the air felt different, thick and heavy, and everything got quieter. I remember looking down at the water, and instead of seeing ripples, I instead saw wrinkles. It's hard to explain. It was more like the sheets of a bed that were recently disturbed. Eventually, the boy shook me and said, "We're here." "Where?" I asked. "Look and see." He pointed out to the water. I leaned over the boat, and I saw a dark shape. Not a fish or a shark or a dolphin. The only way I can really describe it is thick, viscous black oil. It moved and undulated. Before I could ask another question, I felt a sharp push on my back. The boat rocked, and I fell in. I panicked, struggling to breathe, and I would later notice that I didn't feel wet when I hit the water, just slowly sank to the bottom, through the oily mass. Then I wasn't able to move. I had no control over my body, but I kept sinking, panic flooding my mind. But then, once everything went black, I woke up, right beside the lagoon that the boy took me to. But now there was no boy, no boat, no rock. I was soaked head to toe like I'd been swimming, but I didn't know how to swim. When I was playing in the water before, I didn't let it go past my hips. I have no idea what happened to me that day. The Sea Column, from Acre 90. I've been living on a 30-foot sailboat off Oahu for about a year. Some people see it as living rough, but it keeps me afloat, literally and financially. My boat's name isn't important. It's just home, a cramped cabin, a bunk, and a small propane stove. On a clear day, I can see Diamond Head in the distance. On a quiet night, the only sound is water lapping against the boat. I usually sleep well, but a few weeks ago, I had an experience I still can't explain. That night, I turned in early, around 9. I woke later feeling uneasy and checked my phone. 2:14 a.m. No storms, no boats passing nearby, just a strange vibe. I went on deck, expecting the usual star-filled sky and calm seas. Instead, I saw a giant black column on the horizon. It had to be at least 2 miles away, close enough for me to see it plainly, too far to make out details. The thing stretched from the ocean's surface beyond the cloud line, fading into darkness at the top. At first, I thought it might be a waterspout, but it wasn't rotating or swirling. It stood perfectly still. My phone camera was useless in the dark. The pictures showed only black smears. I tried adjusting settings, but none captured a real image. Meanwhile, the column seemed to shift slightly, although I couldn't tell if it was my eyes playing tricks. After a few minutes, it dropped. The top sank straight down, disappearing into the water in one smooth motion over about 10 seconds. No splash, no noise. Then the horizon was empty, as if the column had never been there. I stayed on deck until sunrise, too rattled to sleep. I scanned the ocean for any clue, debris, foam, lights, but saw nothing unusual. By morning, I tried convincing myself it might have been some bizarre weather formation. I sailed to the pier for groceries. Nobody at the dock mentioned seeing anything strange. A couple of days later, I moved to a calmer spot. Around noon, I spotted something floating a few hundred yards away. At first, I thought it was garbage or a log, but it turned out to be a school of small tuna, all belly up. Dozens of them, not a single bite taken. Normally, scavengers would flock to an easy meal, but the water was empty except for these dead fish. I fished one out with a net. Its body looked pristine, no signs of wounds or decay. I let them drift. That incident might have been a fluke, but it happened again a few days later, then a third time. Different fish species, all floating lifeless, none scavenged. I started mentioning these mass fish kills to anyone who would listen, local boaters, fishermen, but nobody seemed to have a clear explanation. Some shrugged, blaming pollution or temperature spikes. Others said it wasn't that uncommon, but they couldn't explain why predators weren't feeding on them. I told my friend Kekoa. He's a conspiracy type, always with theories about aliens, secret bases, suppressed documents. When I described the column and the dead fish, he explained that people think UFOs come from space, but maybe they come from underwater. That tower could have been something submerging, according to him. He launched into stories of rumored undersea craft. I'm not sure I believe in UFOs, but the column dropping straight into the ocean with no disturbance was beyond strange. Keikoa insisted that if a craft emits unknown energy, maybe it's toxic to fish. He claimed the animals sense something wrong and avoid the remains. I didn't know what to say. Even a far-fetched theory beats no theory at all. I tried to see if anyone else had reported a similar black pillar. Nothing turned up in local news. Online, I found vague references to black rods in certain parts of the world, but they didn't mention Hawaii. A small part of me wanted to approach authorities, but who do I call? The Coast Guard? They'd probably think it was a prank or chalk it up to illusions. One night, I tried anchoring near the same spot where I'd first seen the column. The sky was clear, the moon half full. Nothing unusual appeared. I filmed the horizon for an hour. When I played it back, I saw only faint waves in the moonlight. I stayed out there a second night, scanning the darkness. Still nothing. Part of me was relieved. Another part felt weird, like I was missing a chance to understand. I've been narrating these scary stories to you guys for nearly 10 years now. Unfortunately, I've gathered a sort of immunity from scary stories, for the most part. But when a story does feel effective to me, I'll let you know. And today, that first Cliffside story really did it for me. Imagine being stuck in a room, just waiting for a face in the window to appear. And when it never does, you go to look, and you see the smile down there, right before the figure jumps. Good story. I hope you enjoyed the stories today too. That brings us to the end of this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at DarkPrevails. Support the network by becoming a member at eeriecast.com/plus to unlock exclusive access to members-only content. Send me your scary stories of the unexplained if you want me to narrate them at darkstories.org. And help us make Unexplained Encounters the biggest scary podcast out there by following and reviewing us at Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.